Good morning. Welcome to this morning's informational awareness webinar on confined spaces. My name is Ryan Bast of the Motor Safety Association, and I'd like to acknowledge our partners at the Western Equipment Dealers Association, who we host these webinars in conjunction with. I've muted all of the microphones except mine, and they will remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar. However, if you do have any questions, please enter them in the question box, and at the conclusion of the webinar, I'll go through any of the questions and send the answers to all of the attendees. So some of the items that I will discuss today are an introduction to confined spaces, starting in with the definitions. And in Saskatchewan, there is a differentiation between confined spaces and hazardous confined spaces, so I separated them in this webinar. I'll also go over certain items that should be in a training plan for confined spaces, as well as leave you with some tips and tricks of what to look for when conducting hazard and risk assessments for confined spaces. Then I have some industry examples of confined spaces that you may see around your facility. Then the remainder of the webinar will speak to hazardous confined spaces, and before we review and conclude. So as we get started, this webinar will cover points to be aware of for confined spaces to give you some awareness. But again, it's not meant to be a complete hazardous program training session for your confined spaces. It's meant to give you some information and tools to succeed. All attendees will receive examples of confined space safe work practices, a confined space safe entry plan template, as well as procedures to utilize. So it's not necessary to write things along as we go. You can if you wish to, but all attendees will receive sample templates, as well as this webinar will be uploaded to our website for future review. Unfortunately, I open with a sad story where a 23-year-old mechanic died when entering a bulk oil tank. The tank had been purged with nitrogen, and the mechanic entered this tank for an unknown reason and had not tested the atmospheric oxygen level and had unfortunately died of asphyxiation. Through the results of the investigation, the reports indicated the oxygen concentration level was at 12%, and we need a minimum safe level of 19.5% of oxygen in the air to breathe properly. So unfortunately, due to the oxygen level that was too low, the worker died of asphyxiation. And again, this was a very sad incident. Looking closer at our industry and the companies we represent, we had 4 recent WCB claims around confined spaces. And these are coded through the WCB as inhalation in an enclosed, restricted, or confined space. So 4 might not seem like a lot of WCB claims for the size of our industry, but with that being said, 4 people were injured, and there could be a large associated days lost as well as costs from these 4 claims. So don't be fooled by the low number of claims. These can be very expensive into the WCB system, as well as we've seen by the last example, people can in fact die from those oxygen levels if they're not adequate. But before we go much further, what exactly is a confined space? And to summarize from the Saskatchewan regulations, a confined space is not designed for continuous human occupancy except for the purpose of performing work. And it has a restricted entry and exit point. I want you to think about that definition. You could in fact jot it down or just be aware of it, and I'll repeat it again. Because I want you to think about potential confined space examples at your site, location, or dealership or facility as this webinar evolves. and type it into the question box. So just to, we could share some of those at the end. I'll send to the people who attended. I will have some industry examples, but to get you folks involved, think about items that meet this definition. So they're not designed for continuous human occupancy, except for the purpose of performing work, and has a restricted entry and exit point. And as I said, I'll be highlighting some industry examples in the webinar. When we are looking at training requirements for confined space, these items should be covered in your training program. And right at the onboarding orientation process, workers should be made aware that we have a confined space program at our organization so that they are aware of it. And part of that awareness comes from explaining to them what are the confined space hazards and risks at our organization. And as mentioned, I will be highlighting hazard and risk coming up in the slides. But looking closely at your own organization, what are those specific examples of confined spaces? Perhaps you may be looking at something like a sprayer tank could be considered a confined space example. So these are things that people need to be made aware of at your facility. You would also want to explain the use of lockout and tagout. And especially in our industry, a lot of the confined spaces will be around pieces of equipment that people are in fact operating, and they may have a confined space as a part of it. So that's why lockout tagout goes hand in hand with confined spaces. And if you're not as familiar with lockout tagout, some time ago I did a webinar on lockout tagout, which is also uploaded to our website. Your training plan should cover the requirements and limitations of personal protective equipment. It's only as effective as the correct fit that people are wearing it to, and has it been maintained and stored correctly. And when I talk about PPE, we have to always remember this is the last line of defense. When we look at the hazard controls, we should look at trying to reduce the hazard at the source and eliminate it and along the path to the worker before relying on PPE. And I'll exemplify that a little bit later in the webinar. And for hazardous confined spaces, which I'll be talking about later in the webinar, you would need an entry plan. But just like any training program, a good idea is to do an annual review to ensure employee competency. And this could even be done via toolbox talk or a staff meeting to explain to your staff what your confined space training is, to give them a reminder about it. Generally, there are only two reasons for entering a confined space. The first one being to either perform a specific task, such as an inspection, a repair job, or maintenance, or to conduct an emergency rescue. Those are the reasons generally outlined for entering a confined space. So in this picture, you see somebody working in a combine grain tank, and this is an example of a confined space because remember our definition, it was not designed for human occupancy, and it has a restricted entry and exit point. So as we think about industry examples at our dealership or facility, did you think about this one? Next, we look at what are the requirements that we should address before entering a confined space. And in the coming slides, I'll be talking about things to look for in our assessments for hazards and risks. What about exploring alternative means for the worker to possibly not even enter the confined space in the first place? And that's what I was talking about, the hazard control. Does the worker even need to be in the confined space to complete that task? Can we modify that job to not put the worker in the confined space? So these are things that you would look at before sending someone into a confined space. Also, to be sure there is a safe entrance and exit point. with clear egress points. You may have to make any practical alterations to ensure the entrance and exit points are safe without jeopardizing their structural integrity. Conducting assessments for hazard and risk are an important portion of understanding confined space hazards or applicable potential risks. And ask yourself the following questions before conducting a job in a confined space, such as, do I have the proper training to do this job? Do I know what to do if someone sounds the alarm? What's the communication and rescue procedure? Can this confined space become hazardous? So if our ventilation changes occur, have we practiced an emergency drill? Or is the necessary rescue equipment or rescuers available? Is the confined space isolated? So what's our access like to enter a confined space? What about the ventilation? Is the oxygen level safe or not? So again, these are some really good points to think about before sending someone into a confined space or going in yourself. So if this is a piece of equipment, has it been locked out and tagged out? Or what if I'm entering a tank? What's the exposure limit? What type of hazardous product was in this tank? Is the safety data sheet available? Is there an exit procedure or rescue procedure? Or do you have a specific company procedure at your organization? And in Saskatchewan, we can come out to your locations and help you develop any of these procedures specific to working with confined spaces at your organization. A few other points to be aware of, as mentioned, the oxygen levels. Are they deficient? Thinking about the 23-year-old worker who was exposed to an unsafe oxygen level in the tank and died, as mentioned in the introduction. Combustible dust is sometimes overlooked. This can be highly explosive in the atmosphere and is created by finely ground combustible materials, such as grains or dusts. So sometimes you may not think about combustible dust, but it should be a part of your hazard and risk assessment before entering a confined space. Or explosive concentrations that could be produced from gases, vapors, fumes, or mists. Or perhaps an unstable environment that you may find in grain piles, which could be a part of a confined space in a grain bin or silo. So therefore, when I talked about the oxygen levels, it's critical to continuously monitor and test the atmosphere in a confined space for potentially hazardous gases. And the key words there are continuously monitor. Don't just test it once and not again, because conditions can change. Utilizing a multi-gas detector, as seen on this screen, it can be used to detect levels of oxygen, flammable gases, and potentially other toxic air contaminants. One thing to be very sure of is that this type of monitor, if you obtain one of these monitors, that it has been calibrated at the frequency suggested by the manufacturer's specifications. So don't just open it up out of the box and start using it for years on end. Be sure that you, in fact, calibrate this monitor as per the manufacturer set out in their requirements. And these monitors are very handy. The majority of these monitors will feature either a bright, visual, or loud audible alarm to alert workers of these potential hazards. And they'll even, some of them have an internal type of logging system to record the information that it picks up in its sensor. So you can use that for record keeping as well as to empty the records off of the machine once you're finished with it. So it does record the information it finds. Next, I'll talk about confined space examples. And as you can see by this list, confined spaces are not necessarily small or confined, as you can see from these items. And when I asked you earlier to think about confined space examples, did any of you have these as potential examples at your organization? Or did you find other examples? Within this definition, remember, a confined space is not designed for continuous human occupancy except for the purpose of performing work, and it has a restricted entry and exit point, as do these items on the slide. So let's take a closer look at each of these with visual examples. First off is a sprayer tank. So some of the hazards that could be applicable to a sprayer tank are, what if you have a technician that goes into a sprayer tank, perhaps to change a fitting? There may be chemical residue left in the tank that the person could be exposed to, or like any motorized machine, the requirement for lockout tagout to be utilized so that the machine isn't operated while the person is in the tank. Another example could be an air cart. What if you have one of your workers inside the air tank or air cart, perhaps changing a bin level sensor? Someone happens to close the tank, fires up the fan, and pressurizes the tank. Again, that's a certain hazard that could occur potentially. And as by the definition, these do also fall under an example of a confined space. Another example would be a grain cart. What if you have a worker in the bottom of the grain cart and they're changing a bearing on the lower flighting? Hazards could include somebody starting up the grain cart and turning on the flighting, which could severely injure somebody. So as you can see from the last examples, lockout, tagout really correlates with confined spaces, especially when it comes to equipment safety, when the equipment itself is the confined space. And sometimes in the equipment facilities, we see different types of oil change drain pits. And some hazards associated with these could be low levels of oxygen that may be in place for the people working in these drain pits, so not sufficient ventilation or exchanges of the air, or even equipment falling in on the workers, or tooling falling in on the workers that are in the oil change drain pits. So again, that is an example of a confined space. Another one could be, this is a picture of the inside of a combine, and if you have somebody working inside of the combine and someone starts it up and engages the separator, they could be killed. So especially lockout, tagout is so critical when people are servicing inner machinery components. And think about that at your facility. Where are some of these types of machines or components that a worker could be exposed to? And are you utilizing a lockout, tagout? Or did you consider it as a confined space? Also at your organization, you may have contractors accessing ductwork, and this too is an example of a confined space at your organization. What about a paint booth? Paint booth hazards could include what if the filters aren't changed at the regular intervals and the paint booth itself hasn't been maintained with the correct ventilation procedures, and if the worker hasn't been wearing a fitted respirator that's applicable to that worker. So again, a paint booth could also be an example of a confined space. So I'll switch gears now and talk a bit about the hazardous confined spaces. And in Saskatchewan regulations, these differ between confined spaces and hazardous confined spaces. And the rest of the webinar will cover hazardous confined spaces. These have a restricted entry and exit point. Due to its design, construction, or materials, it may become hazardous, and it has poor natural ventilation. So some examples that we may consider around a hazardous confined space could be a grain bin. If someone were to go in a grain bin, they could suffocate, and the grain bin is unstable. It also has restricted entry and exit, and again could be hazardous for the reasons mentioned. Another example would be a bulk tank. You may have one of these at your organization, or you may be a bulk tank or bulk fuel distributor and have numerous tanks. So hazards with this could include ventilation. Someone would happen to fall into a tank, they could drown. Or there could be very questionable oxygen levels, not to mention how explosive the contents could be associated within one of these bulk tanks. And where we've seen the hazards specifically, I've actually seen the aftermath of this. One of the equipment shops that we worked with, they brought in a tanker trailer such as this seen in the picture. And they started conducting service work to the trailer. And they thought that the tank had been emptied and purged, but that wasn't the case. And they had an explosion, and it blew the lid off of this tank, and it went through the roof of the dealership. So again, as you can see, and that's probably something you may find more common if you're servicing heavy trucks, if people are pulling these types of trailers into your organization or into your service shops or even onto your lots. What are in these tanks? Could they leak out? And from a hazardous confined space definition, we could have dangers around ventilation, drowning, oxygen levels, and the one that I had seen were the explosiveness of the product that were in the tanker trailers. So keep that in mind if you have these in your lot or in your shop. Make sure that you have assessed the hazards and risks that associate with that. So when it comes to hazardous confined spaces, you need to have an entry plan in place. And the items that should be included in your entry plan, and again, these are just for hazardous confined spaces by definition. So you need to have a continuous process used to measure oxygen levels, as well as a system for identifying the hazards and risks that may be present. So your system may encompass doing an assessment before someone enters a hazardous confined space, as well as a procedure for entrance and exiting safely, as well as the availability and proper use of personal protective equipment. And I have a sample entry plan that you can use that I'll be sending as a template for the webinar attendees today. This is a great tool because you can, in fact, utilize this template for the entry plan if you have workers that work around hazardous confined spaces. The entry plan should also include the emergency response procedure and rescue procedure. So do you contact 911? Do you have local on-site responders? So these are items that you would utilize. How do you maintain an effective two-way communication with the worker? So you want to be able to communicate with the worker in the hazardous confined space and have that worker be able to communicate back to you. And keeping a copy of the hazardous confined space entry plan readily available at the entrance of the confined space. So have that document available. So once you've completed your hazardous confined space entry plan, you could also complete an entry permit and display that outside of your hazardous confined space. Its primary purpose is to ensure the safety of those inside the hazardous confined space. Some items that should be on the permit include the names of the people that are actually in the hazardous confined space, as well as the attendant, that's the person responsible for the hazardous confined space, as well as the on-site supervisor. and also discuss what you've done to address the ventilation and PPE requirements. Some of these may not be applicable to all hazardous confined spaces, but I'll review them anyway in its entirety to give you those potential examples. Others could be around the air quality testing. So when did we test? And what were the results? And having that information on your permit. What are the expected in and out times of the hazardous confined space? Because without knowing that, what if the worker is not even in the confined space and you believe he is, or vice versa? Also ensuring emergency precautions and rescue equipment is available is a great step to ensure the safety of workers. So highlighting that in your entry permit. And highlighting the results as well as the overview of your entry plan that was developed, as well as your hazard and risk and rescue plans that were completed. So good information to have available on your permit. I talked a little bit about the confined space attendants. I'll just go over what their roles and responsibilities are. For starters, for hazardous confined space, you need to have an attendant posted at the entrance of the hazardous confined space. And one of the most critical responsibilities for that attendant is to never ever abandon their post or where they have set up for their confined space or at the entrance of the hazardous confined space. This person's primary role is to be available, and their responsibilities include having that two-way communication with the worker, being able to talk with the worker and hear back from the worker, as well as preventing unauthorized entry. So you don't need a bunch of other people going into the hazardous confined space that should not be there. So the attendant is called out on that role to prevent that unauthorized entry. So as you can see, very important for the hazardous confined space attendant to never abandon their post. I'll also touch on here a bit about the rescue plan for the hazardous confined spaces. And 70% of confined space fatalities occur due to would-be rescuers. And this is all too common, where the rescuers themselves put themselves at high risk. So they, as mentioned before, that 23-year-old worker in the tank that was purged with nitrogen, somebody may try to go in and rescue that worker and in fact become a fatality themselves. So that's where the majority of confined space fatalities occur, are the would-be rescuers and in their attempts to rescue someone from a confined space. So that's why it's so critical to communicate with rescue personnel and have these confined spaces and hazardous confined spaces identified so that we know of the potential hazards, so to prevent the fatalities from the would-be rescuers. The rescuers would need to treat all confined spaces as hazardous, because it may have changed as far as the ventilation or the entrance and exit portions have now turned the confined space to very hazardous. So don't rely on doing the sniff test, as your nose cannot smell certain toxic gases. Your nose can also not determine if an adequate level of oxygen is present. So there may not be any gases or vapors, but your nose cannot tell you if the oxygen level is adequate or not. So therefore, it's important to test those atmospheric conditions with a monitor. A good opportunity is to invite local EMS or first responders for a training scenario when it comes to hazardous confined spaces at your organization. This is a good practice because it helps you ensure that your rescue equipment is readily available and it's been inspected and in safe working condition. So why not be proactive and set up a training scenario to involve local responders, because it gives them skills to practice, and it allows you to ensure or identify if there's any gaps in your rescue plan or if you're missing anything. And so this is a great opportunity to include. And just on a side note, utilize this for all types of emergency response procedures at your organization involving local EMS or first responders. It gives them a chance to be participatory and keep their skill set practiced. And I say that as a retired emergency first responder, that practicing those additional scenarios are always effective, especially in that controlled type of environment. So that kind of gets us to the end, or close to the end of our confined space awareness webinar. But I hope that when I talked to you earlier about providing examples of confined spaces, did you find any additional confined spaces that I did not highlight or mention? And if so, enter them in the question box, because I'd like to share those with the other attendees so we can learn from each other. And when we look at the Plan, Do, Check, Act circle, have you identified the confined spaces in your workplace? Perhaps maybe now you may be thinking more of a potential confined space that we didn't talk about, or that you may not have been aware of earlier until we talked about it today. So identify those confined spaces. Ensure that people are trained on what they need to do if they have to work in those confined spaces. And be sure to involve emergency and rescue planning if that is, if you do have those types of confined spaces at your organization. And unless you have a full-fledged confined space program in place, it's always a great idea to reevaluate that plan and see where you're at and look for continuous improvement. So as I mentioned earlier, all the attendees will receive copies of a safe work practice for confined spaces. I have a confined space entry plan and templates available, as well as safe work procedures. So feel free to use those, edit them, make them your own. So there's a lot of value in that. So feel free to utilize any of those documents that I'm going to email out to you this morning. You'll also receive a webinar educational certificate. Put your name on it, save it for a copy that you participated in today's webinar. As well as feel free to leave feedback on the webinar, including future suggested topics. As this topic today, it was suggested by a dealer group that was looking for more information on confined spaces. So I'd like to deliver on the types of topics that you folks are asking for. So please feel free to suggest topics that you'd like to see future webinars are on for the next quarter. And like all webinars, they'll be posted to our website for future review. I will leave the webinar open here for another minute to allow people to enter any questions that they may have, or different information of examples they want to share for confined spaces. However, if you are still looking for more information after what you've heard today and what I will be sending you, feel free to contact our office at the number provided, or send an email to the contact email address listed on the screen. So at this time, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to spend with me this morning on confined space awareness. And as mentioned, I will leave the webinar open for a little bit longer, just as you enter any of those last questions. Thank you very much.